Friday evenings usually felt predictable, and this one started no differently, a quiet dinner in our cozy suburban home in Springfield, Illinois, with the low hum of the TV providing a soothing backdrop. Emily, my wife of 5 years, had just set the table. Her smile, a tired, worn expression I'd grown used to over the past year, hovered briefly before vanishing as her thoughts drifted elsewhere. I didn't think much of it. It had been a long day for both of us, and I still clung to the hope that we could have a peaceful night. As we ate, our conversation meandered through the usual topics: updates about work, plans for the weekend, family commitments. It was nothing extraordinary but carried a comforting familiarity. And then it happened, a moment so small yet so piercing that it splintered everything. We had landed on the subject of finances, a recurring point of tension in our marriage. The latest was a hefty, unexpected car repair bill. Emily's irritation felt sharper than usual. "We should have been better prepared for this," she said, her tone cutting through the fragile calm like a knife. "I understand," I replied evenly, trying to keep my voice steady. "But it's not like I could have predicted the car breaking down." I hated arguments, especially over things outside our control. She sighed heavily and placed her fork down with a sharp clink. "It's just, you're always so reactive, never proactive." When I was with Michael, she stopped abruptly, but the damage had already been done. For a second, everything froze. The murmuring TV, the faint hum of the fridge, even the clink of her fork, all of it faded into silence. All I could hear was that name ringing in my head. Michael. Her ex. The man she'd been with for 4 years before me. The man whose name had started to creep into conversations more often than I was comfortable with. I stared at her, feeling my appetite vanish entirely. "When you were with Michael, what?" I asked, my voice low but shaky. Her face flushed red. "I didn't mean it like that," she blurted out quickly. He was always good at handling stuff like this." "Like what?" I pressed, my voice rising despite my effort to stay composed. "Money problems? Stress? Or being your husband?" The room suddenly felt colder, like all the warmth had been sucked out of it. She didn't answer, but the way her eyes dropped to the table told me everything I needed to know. For 5 years, I'd done everything I could to be the man she needed, her partner, her confidant, her anchor. And now, in one careless sentence, she reduced me to a pale comparison of someone she still clearly admired. "Wow," I said, pushing my chair back. "Just, wow." "Daniel, that's not what I meant," she said, standing up as I headed toward the living room. "You're blowing this out of proportion." "No," I said, turning to face her. "I think I heard you loud and clear. At least Michael would have handled it better, right?" "That's what you were going to say." "It's not about Michael," she snapped, her frustration boiling over. I'm tired. You never think ahead, and I'm always left to pick up the slack." Her words hit me hard, not just for what she said, but for everything she didn't say. In that moment, I wasn't Daniel, her husband. I was a placeholder, a poor substitute for a man she hadn't let go of. I didn't yell. I didn't slam the door or lash out, even though anger and hurt were boiling inside me. Instead, I walked to the bedroom, closed the door behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. The rest of the night passed in a blur. Emily knocked softly on the door, her voice gentler now, asking me to come out and talk. I couldn't bring myself to face her, not yet. Hours later, when I finally opened the door, the house was silent. She had gone to bed. I stood in the doorway, watching her sleep. The same face I'd loved for so many years now stirred feelings of pain and doubt. Her words replayed in my mind, louder and heavier with every passing second. "At least Michael would have handled this better." Those weren't just words. They were a verdict, a declaration that I would never be enough. As I stood there, a quiet resolve began to take shape inside me. I wasn't sure what I would do or where this decision would lead, but for the first time that night, I felt certain of one thing: something had to change. If she couldn't accept me for who I was, imperfections and all, then maybe it was time to go. The thought echoed in my head, solidifying with every passing second. I told myself I'd pack my bags the next day. Sleep didn't come that night. Instead, I lay on the couch, staring up at the ceiling fan as it spun lazily overhead, its creaking blades marking time like a metronome for my spiraling thoughts. Emily's words replayed in my mind on an endless loop. At least Michael would have handled this better. Not, I wish we had handled this better, or even, we could have done better. No, it was Michael, the man who wasn't there, the man who, for all his supposed perfection, hadn't stuck around to marry her. And yet, here I was, 5 years into our marriage, still living in his shadow. The next morning, I stayed on the couch until the first rays of sunlight peeked through the blinds. Emily never came looking for me, which I took as her way of avoiding the fallout. When I finally got up, the house was unnervingly quiet. Her car was gone, and on the kitchen counter was a hastily scrawled note: "Went for a drive. We'll talk when I get back. Emily." I crumpled the note in my fist and tossed it straight into the trash. Talk about what? How she could act like her words hadn't cut me to the core. I made myself a cup of coffee, but it tasted bitter, like the resentment I could feel building in my chest. As I sat at the table, staring into the inky black liquid, old memories began to resurface. I thought about the early days of our marriage, back when everything seemed simpler. We were happy then, or at least I thought we were. We'd rented a small one-bedroom apartment in downtown Springfield, juggling demanding jobs while trying to carve out a life together. We didn't have much, but back then, I believed we had each other. But as I sat there, more cracks came to mind, subtle things I had ignored. The way Emily would let out an exasperated sigh when I couldn't fix something as quickly as she wanted. Her sharp tone when she thought I wasn't pulling my weight. And those little flickers of disappointment in her eyes, ones I hadn't fully understood until now, whenever I suggested something simpler than what she was used to. One memory in particular hit hard. It was Thanksgiving at her parents' house. Her mom had asked me how things were going at work, and before I could even answer, Emily had chimed in with a laugh: "He's doing fine, though I wish he had Michael's drive. That guy was always so ambitious." She had laughed as if it were a harmless joke, but I remember how the words had caught in my throat when I tried to laugh along. She hadn't even noticed. Now, sitting alone in our kitchen, I couldn't dismiss what I'd spent years trying to overlook. Emily didn't just have fond memories of Michael. She seemed to hold him up as a standard, an ideal I could never reach. And that realization? It crushed me. By noon, I couldn't take sitting still any longer. I got up and walked into our bedroom. The closet stood open, the sight of our neatly organized clothes a cruel reminder of the life we'd built together. My shirts and slacks hung on the left, hers on the right, side by side, like a silent symbol of our partnership. But now, it all felt hollow, a life built on shaky ground. Without hesitation, I grabbed a suitcase and started packing. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. I'd made up my mind the night before, standing in the doorway while she slept. This wasn't just about last night's argument. It was about years of feeling like a background character in my own marriage, watching my life play out as if someone else were writing the script. As I folded my clothes and placed them into the suitcase, my eyes landed on a framed photo sitting on the dresser. It was from our wedding day. Emily looked radiant in her flowing white dress, and I was grinning beside her in a tuxedo that had been a bit too snug. We both looked so happy, so sure of forever. I picked up the picture, staring at it like it might reveal some hidden truth, some clue that this moment had been inevitable. But all I saw were two people who had once believed in each other. Setting the photo face down on the dresser, I zipped the suitcase shut. The sound felt final, like the closing of a chapter. Everything felt surreal, like I was watching someone else's life unravel in slow motion. Emily came home about an hour later. I was sitting on the couch, the suitcase waiting by the door. The look on her face when she saw it was a blend of shock and panic. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I'm leaving," I said, keeping my tone calm but firm. Her eyes darted between me and the suitcase. "Daniel, wait. Can we please talk about this?" I shook my head slowly. "We've been talking for 5 years, Emily. I just didn't realize I was having a conversation with your past." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I almost reconsidered, almost. But then I remembered the sting of her words, the way they had sliced through me like a blade. "Goodbye, Emily," I said, grabbing my suitcase and walking out the door. For the first time in years, I felt something unexpected: freedom. I drove aimlessly for hours after leaving the house, the suitcase rattling in the trunk with every bump in the road. My phone buzzed repeatedly in the passenger seat, calls and texts, undoubtedly from Emily, but I couldn't bring myself to look at them. Not yet. I needed space. I needed quiet. I needed something to calm the storm raging inside me. Eventually, I found myself pulling into the parking lot of a budget motel on the outskirts of Springfield. The place was far from impressive: peeling paint, a flickering neon sign, and a roof that sagged under its own weight. But for tonight, it would do. I paid for a single room in cash, not wanting Emily to trace me through a credit card statement. The room smelled faintly of mildew and industrial cleaner, but I didn't care. I tossed my suitcase onto the bed and sank into the worn-out chair by the window, staring at the dingy curtains as if they held answers to the questions swirling in my head. The silence was overwhelming. For the first time in years, there was no sound of Emily moving through the house, no clinking of dishes or murmuring of the TV in the background. Just stillness, heavy and unrelenting. Reluctantly, I picked up my phone, knowing full well what would be waiting for me. 23 messages from Emily, each one more desperate than the last. "Daniel, where are you? Please come back. We can talk about this. I'm sorry. I didn't mean it like that. You're being unfair, Daniel. This isn't like you. Please, just answer me." I didn't reply. What could I even say? That I'd spent 5 years living in the shadow of a man she still seemed to idolize? That I wasn't sure if I ever truly knew her at all? Instead, I turned off my phone and tossed it onto the bed, letting the silence swallow me once again. The next morning, I was jolted awake by a loud pounding on the door. My heart leapt, and for a brief moment, I thought it might be Emily. But when I opened the door, I saw my brother, Ryan, standing there, looking furious. "Man, what the hell is going on?" he demanded, barging into the room without waiting for an invitation. "Emily called me in tears last night. She said you just up and left." I groaned, rubbing my temples. Of course she'd called him. Of course. "Ryan, don't," I said, but he cut me off. "Don't Ryan me," he snapped, crossing his arms as he glared at me. "What's going on, Daniel? And don't give me some vague nonsense. Spill it." I sighed heavily and sat down on the edge of the bed, gesturing for him to take the chair by the window. For the next 20 minutes, I laid everything out for Ryan: the argument, Emily's comment about Michael, and the years of subtle comparisons that had finally pushed me to my breaking point. He didn't interrupt, just listened intently as his expression shifted from confusion to understanding and then, finally, anger. "Damn," he said when I finished. "That's rough, man. But are you sure walking out was the right call? I mean, it was just one comment." "It wasn't just one comment," I shot back, my voice sharper than I intended. "It was the tipping point, years of this thing hanging over us. She's always held him up like he's some perfect guy I'll never measure up to. How do you come back from that? Ryan leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms thoughtfully. I get it, Daniel. I do. But leaving? That's not going to fix anything. You've got to figure out what you really want. If it's over, fine. But if there's even the slightest chance you want to save this marriage, you owe it to yourself, and to her, to have that conversation. His words stayed with me long after he left. The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted. Part of me still loved Emily, still longed for the life we had built together. But another part of me, the part that had packed my suitcase and walked out the door, was just plain exhausted. Tired of feeling like I'd never be enough. Tired of trying to live up to a man who wasn't even around anymore. By midday, I found myself driving again. This time, I ended up at Riverside Park, a quiet spot where Emily and I used to spend countless afternoons. It was the kind of place where people came to clear their heads. I sat on a weathered bench overlooking the lake, watching ripples dance across the water. As I stared out at the stillness, I realized I needed answers, not just from Emily, but from myself. Why had I let things get to this point? Why hadn't I spoken up sooner, before the resentment had taken root? And most importantly, what did I want now? Moving forward, what was I looking for? Closure, reconciliation, or something else entirely? When I got back to the motel that evening, I finally turned my phone back on. There were more messages from Emily, but one stood out. Daniel, I know I've hurt you. I didn't realize how much until now. If you're willing, I'd like to meet and talk. No excuses, no defenses, just the truth. Please. I stared at the screen, rereading her words before typing a short reply, okay. Tomorrow. Let me know where. As I hit send, a small flicker of something stirred inside me, hope. Not necessarily hope for reconciliation, but hope for clarity. For closure. For the chance to finally confront everything that had been left unsaid and figure out, once and for all, where we were headed. The next day, I pulled up to the Maple Leaf Cafe, a cozy spot Emily had suggested. It was a place we used to go to when we first started dating, and it felt strangely fitting to be meeting here, a place that had once symbolized the beginning of something beautiful, now possibly marking its end. The moment I walked in, I saw her. She was sitting by the window, hands clasped tightly around a mug of coffee. Her shoulders were slumped, her face pale and drawn. When the bell above the door chimed, she looked up, and our eyes met. For a brief moment, there was something in her gaze, an apology, maybe, or regret. I took a deep breath and walked over. Hi, I said, sliding into the seat across from her. Hi, she replied softly, her voice barely above a whisper. An awkward silence settled between us, thick and uncomfortable. I broke it first. So, I said, leaning back in my chair, you wanted to talk. Emily nodded, setting her mug down. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in her lap. Daniel, I've spent the past couple of days thinking about what I said, about what it really meant, and about how we got here. I stayed silent, letting her speak. She sighed deeply, her shoulders sagging further. I know I hurt you. And I know it wasn't just the other night. There have been so many moments where I've said or done things that made you feel like you weren't enough. And for that, I'm sorry. Her voice trembled, and for a moment, I couldn't bring myself to respond. When I finally did, my voice came out steadier than I felt inside. Why, Emily? I asked, leaning forward. Why bring him up? Why compare me to Michael, of all people? She flinched, almost as if the name itself hurt to hear. I don't know, she admitted after a pause. At first, I thought it was just frustration. But the truth is, I think I've been holding on to this idea of Michael that wasn't even real. We broke up for a reason, Daniel. He wasn't perfect, and he definitely wasn't the man I wanted to spend my life with. But in moments of stress, I guess I used him as a kind of benchmark. Something to throw out there when I didn't know how else to say what I was feeling. Her words stung, cutting deeper than I wanted to admit. But they also brought a strange kind of clarity. So what? I asked, my tone harsher than I intended. I was just your punching bag? A way to let out your frustrations? No, she said quickly, shaking her head. That's not what I mean. I love you, Daniel. I've always loved you. But somewhere along the way, I think I let my expectations get tangled up in my own insecurities. It wasn't fair to you, and it wasn't fair to us. I leaned back in my chair, her words swirling in my mind. Part of me wanted to lash out, to remind her just how unfair it was to spend 5 years living in the shadow of a man she didn't even want anymore. But another part of me, the part that still cared, recognized the vulnerability in her voice. She was trying, in her own way, to fix what she had broken. Do you even know how hard it is, I asked, my voice softer now, to hear his name over and over? To feel like I'm constantly being compared to someone who isn't even here? She nodded, her eyes welling with tears. I do now, she said, her voice cracking. And I hate that I made you feel that way. Her honesty caught me off guard, but it wasn't enough to erase the ache that had settled deep inside me. I looked out the window, watching a couple stroll hand in hand down the sidewalk, their laughter faint but audible. I don't know if I can come back from this, Emily, I said finally, my gaze still fixed on the street. I don't know if we can. Her face crumpled, but she didn't argue. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, sliding it across the table toward me. I wrote this, she said quietly. It's everything I've been feeling, everything I've been too scared to say out loud. I know I can't fix this overnight, but I wanted you to have it. To know how much you mean to me. I unfolded the paper and skimmed the first few lines. It was a letter, raw, emotional, filled with apologies and memories of better times. It was clear she'd poured her heart into it. For a brief moment, I felt the wall I'd built around myself start to crack. I don't expect an answer right now, she added, her voice barely audible. I needed you to know. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket. Thank you, I said, and I meant it. We sat in silence after that, the weight of the conversation pressing down on us. Finally, I stood, signaling that it was time to end the conversation. I need time, Emily, I said. Time to figure out what I want. She nodded, her expression resigned but understanding. Take all the time you need, she said. I'll be here if you're ready to talk again. That night, back in the motel, I read Emily's letter twice. Her words were sincere, heartfelt, even, but they didn't erase the pain or the lingering questions. What did I want? Could I forgive her? And could I forgive myself for letting things get this far? As I lay on the lumpy motel bed, staring up at the cracked ceiling, I realized I didn't have the answers yet. But for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something resembling hope. Maybe not hope for us, but hope for myself, for finding a way forward, no matter where that path might lead. 2 weeks passed before I saw Emily again. In that time, I stayed at the motel, trying to piece together what my life might look like without her. I threw myself into work during the day, grateful for the distraction, but the nights were harder. Every quiet moment seemed to pull me back into memories of our life together, the laughter, the arguments, and everything in between. The days were manageable, thanks to the distraction of work, but the evenings, those were harder. In the quiet of my motel room, memories of our life together seeped in, the good, the bad, and all the messy moments in between. I read Emily's letter several more times during those nights, each time peeling back another layer of her vulnerability. But it wasn't just the words on the page, it was what they represented. She wanted to fix what we'd broken. The question was whether I had the strength, or the will, to meet her halfway. That uncertainty gnawed at me until I finally decided to text her, keeping it short and simple, "Let's talk." "Coffee?" She replied almost instantly, suggesting the same cafe where we'd met before. When I walked in, she was already there, seated at the same table by the window. This time, her posture seemed more relaxed, though her hand still nervously fidgeted with the handle of her coffee mug. I set my drink down and took the seat across from her. The scene felt familiar, but the air between us was charged with tension. "Thanks for meeting me," she said softly. I nodded, taking a sip of my coffee. "Thanks for agreeing." For a moment, neither of us spoke. It was like we were both waiting for the other to break the silence. Finally, she did. "How have you been?" she asked, her tone tentative. I shrugged. "Okay. It's been different. Quiet." She winced at my words but stayed quiet, her eyes fixed on her mug as she traced the rim with her finger. "I've missed you," she said after a pause, her words hitting me with an unexpected pang, regret, maybe, or longing. "I've missed you too," I admitted, though the weight of the words surprised me. "But that doesn't mean everything's fine." "I know," she said quickly, her eyes lifting to meet mine. "I don't expect it to be. I want to understand where we go from here. If we go anywhere at all." Her honesty took me off guard. For years, we'd danced around our problems, sidestepping the deeper conversations we both knew needed to happen. Now, here we were, faced with what felt like our last chance to confront the truth head-on. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," I began, my voice steady but low. "About us. About what happened. And about why I left. And the truth is, Emily, it wasn't just about Michael." Her eyes widened slightly, but she stayed silent, letting me continue. "It was about feeling like I wasn't enough," I said, the words coming easier than I expected. "Like no matter what I did, I could never live up to this version of me you had in your head. And that wasn't fair, not to you, and definitely not to me." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly blinked them away. "I never meant to make you feel that way," she said, her voice trembling. "I was projecting my own insecurities onto you, and I didn't see how much it was hurting you. I thought if I pushed you, you'd step up in ways that would make me feel more secure. But all I did was push you away." Her words hung heavy in the air, raw and unfiltered. For the first time, I felt like we were truly seeing each other, not as husband and wife, but as flawed, imperfect people trying to navigate the messiness of a relationship. "I need to ask you something," I said after a moment, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside me. "Do you still have feelings for Michael?" Her head snapped up, her wide eyes locking onto mine. "No," she said firmly, without hesitation. "Absolutely not. I haven't for years. When I bring him up, it's not because I miss him or want him back. It's because I've built up this romanticized version of him in my head, and it's not even real. That's not fair to you, and it's not fair to me either." Her honesty disarmed me, and for the first time, I felt a glimmer of understanding. This wasn't about Michael. It was about her struggles, her fears, and her insecurities. That didn't erase the pain she'd caused, but it helped me see the bigger picture. "So," I said, leaning forward, my gaze steady, "where does that leave us? Because I can't go back to the way things were." She nodded, her expression resolute. "I don't want to go back to the way things were either. I want us to build something better. But I know that's not something I can decide for both of us. If you're willing to try, I'll do whatever it takes, therapy, counseling, whatever you need. And if you're not, I'll respect that too." Her words hung in the air, heavy with sincerity. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes drifting to the bustling street outside the window. Part of me wanted to take her at her word, to believe that we could rebuild what had been broken. But another part, the part that had packed that suitcase and walked away, wasn't sure if I could trust her enough, or even trust myself, to try. "I need time," I said finally, my voice quiet but steady. "Time to figure out what I want, and to make sure that if we do this, we're doing it for the right reasons." She nodded again, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "Take all the time you need," she said softly. "I'll be here, no matter what." As I left the cafe, I felt an unfamiliar mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and the faintest flicker of hope. For years, Emily and I had avoided the hard conversations, the ones that might have forced us to confront our problems head-on. But now, we'd finally opened the door to something real. Whether that door would lead us back to each other or down separate paths, I didn't know. But for the first time in a long time, it felt like I was finally moving forward. The weeks that followed were some of the most introspective of my life. I moved out of the motel and into a small rental apartment in downtown Springfield. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom space with outdated furniture and a leaky faucet, but it was mine. A place where I could breathe and think without the weight of someone else's expectations pressing down on me. Emily and I stayed in touch, but only sparingly. We exchanged a few texts, mostly about dividing up household items and updating addresses for bills. There were no arguments, no desperate pleas to come back, just a quiet, mutual understanding that we both needed space to figure out what came next. During that time, I turned inward. I started journaling, something I hadn't done since college. At first, it felt awkward, like I was trying to force words onto the page. But before long, it became a safe space to unload my thoughts. I wrote about the sting of Emily's words, the years of feeling like I wasn't enough, and the ways I had let my own insecurities grow unchecked. I also began seeing a therapist, Dr. Bennett, a middle-aged woman with a calm demeanor and a talent for asking the questions I didn't want to answer. In those sessions, I unpacked not just the breakdown of my marriage, but also my own patterns, my tendency to avoid conflict, my fear of failure, and my habit of tying my self-worth to how others perceived me. "You can't control how someone else sees you, Daniel," Dr. Bennett said one afternoon, leaning back in her chair. "What you can control is how you see yourself. The real question isn't whether you were enough for Emily. The question is, are you enough for you?" That question lingered long after I left her office. It was uncomfortable, forcing me to confront parts of myself I'd ignored for years. One evening, Emily reached out, suggesting we meet for dinner. She assured me it wasn't about reconciliation but a chance to touch base and see where we stood. I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to face her again, but after some thought, I agreed. We met at the Olive Grove, a quiet Italian restaurant we used to frequent in the early days of our marriage. The familiarity of the place was both comforting and bittersweet. When she walked in, she looked different, lighter, somehow, as if the weeks apart had allowed her to shed some of the weight she'd been carrying. "I've been seeing a therapist," she said after we ordered. "I realized a lot of what happened between us wasn't just about you or the marriage. It was about me, about how I was projecting my fears and insecurities onto you. I've got a lot of work to do, but I'm trying." I nodded, appreciating her honesty. "I've been in therapy too," I said. "And I've realized I wasn't as communicative as I should have been. There were so many times I bottled things up instead of talking to you about how I was feeling." For the first time in what felt like forever, we were having an honest conversation, no blame, no defensiveness, just two people trying to understand each other and themselves. By the end of the evening, we acknowledged that while there was still love between us, rebuilding our marriage would take time, effort, and even then, there were no guarantees. But for now, we agreed to continue therapy, individually and, eventually, together. It wasn't a promise of reconciliation, but it was a step forward. In the months that followed, I began to rediscover who I was outside of our marriage. I reconnected with old friends, picked up hobbies I'd long abandoned, and even signed up for a woodworking class, something I'd always wanted to try but never found the time for. Slowly, piece by piece, I started to feel whole again, not as half of a couple, but as an individual. Emily and I continued to meet occasionally, not as husband and wife, but as two people trying to navigate the complexities of a broken relationship. Some days were hopeful, filled with flashes of what we once had. Other days were tough, reminders of the wounds we'd inflicted on each other. But through it all, we remained honest, something we hadn't been in a long time. Eventually, we reached a crossroads. After months of therapy and reflection, we sat down and had the conversation we'd both been avoiding. "I love you, Daniel," Emily said, her voice steady but soft. "And I always will. But I think we're better off apart. We've both grown so much these past months, but I think our paths are leading us in different directions." Her words were bittersweet, but I knew she was right. I nodded, the sting of tears welling in my eyes. "I love you too," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "And I want the best for you, whether that's with me or not." We parted ways that day with a mixture of sadness and gratitude, sadness for what we'd lost, but gratitude for what we'd learned and for the chance to move forward stronger than we were before. In the end, I didn't find closure in the way I expected. There was no tidy resolution, no perfect ending. But I found something better: peace. I learned that relationships are messy, complicated, and rarely perfect. I also learned that my worth isn't defined by someone else's approval but by how I see myself. Life isn't about living up to someone else's expectations. It's about creating your own path. And for the first time in years, I felt ready to do just that.